What if I told you that the greatest fortresses in early America weren't built of stone or steel, but of whispered alliances, hidden pathways, and the quiet courage of ordinary people? What if the most sophisticated defense systems were invisible to the naked eye, woven from smoke signals, dream visions, and the endless patience of those who knew their land like their own heartbeat? Tonight, we're stepping back through the mists of time into a world where survival was an art form, where every dawn brought both beauty and uncertainty, and where the line between the spiritual and the strategic was as thin as morning fog over a still lake. Before we step into this quiet journey through the forgotten world of Native American defenders, I'd love a small favor. Tap the like button if your heart is ready to wander back in time with me tonight. Be sure to subscribe so you'll always be part of these late-night passages into history's forgotten corners. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Some of you may be awake in the stillness of night, others just beginning your morning, or somewhere in between. I treasure seeing how far our circle of time travelers reaches. Because trust me, what comes next is a story you won't want to miss. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum, and let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. Close your eyes if you wish, and let your mind drift back through the centuries, to a time when the rhythm of days was measured not by clocks but by the turning of seasons, the migration of buffalo, and the eternal dance between earth and sky. Imagine yourself stirring from sleep, not to the gentle chime of an alarm, but to the harsh reality of frozen breath clouding the air above your face. The buffalo hide that covers you is stiff with frost, and the woven reed mat beneath you has absorbed the earth's deep cold through the long night. Your hip aches where it pressed against the unforgiving ground, and your shoulder throbs from sleeping on your side, curled tight against the bitter air. You are not a chief. You are not a medicine man with sacred visions guiding your path. You are not a storyteller whose words carry the wisdom of generations. You are simply one among many, a young warrior, perhaps 20 winters old, tasked with the endless grinding responsibility of protection. Your name may be forgotten by history, but your life, repeated countless times across the vast expanse of what would one day be called America, tells the true story of survival. The rhythm of your days begins before dawn, when the first pale light filters through the smoke hole above. Your stomach already gnaws at itself with hunger. It has been doing so for hours, a constant companion that never quite leaves you, even after the best meals. This morning, like most mornings, there will be a thin porridge of ground corn, perhaps sweetened with a precious handful of berries your sister gathered yesterday. Perhaps not. The children will eat first, then the elders, then the women, and finally, if anything remains, you. You roll from your sleeping place with practiced silence, your bare feet finding the packed earth floor without a sound. Around you, the breathing of your family continues in the gentle rhythm of sleep. Your mother, your younger brother, who dreams of joining the warriors next season, your grandmother whose weathered hands have woven 1,000 baskets, and whose eyes have seen more winters than you can imagine. Their warmth is both a comfort and a reminder of your burden. These sleeping forms depend on your vigilance, your skill, your willingness to face whatever dangers the day might bring. The morning air outside your dwelling cuts through your skin like a blade. Whether you call home a longhouse among the Iroquois, with its bark walls echoing the soft murmurs of many families, or a earth lodge among the plains tribes, partially buried against the prairie winds, the cold is democracy's truest expression. It touches everyone equally, without regard for status or strength. Your breath forms small clouds that dissipate quickly in the still air, and your fingers, already stiff and clumsy, fumble with the leather ties of your moccasins. The village around you is stirring to life with the quiet efficiency born of necessity. Smoke begins to rise from cooking fires, thin grey ribbons ascending toward a sky that promises snow later in the day. You can smell the familiar mixture of wood smoke, cooking food, and the musky scent of the buffalo robes and deer hides that keep your people warm. It's a smell that speaks of survival, of making do with what the earth provides, of finding comfort in the most basic elements of existence. Your first task, like every morning, is water. The stream lies perhaps half a mile from the village, and the path there winds through woods where enemies might hide. You move through the forest with the careful attention your father taught you. Every broken twig noted, every unusual sound catalogued, every shadow examined for signs of movement that shouldn't be there. The water basket on your back grows heavier with each step on the return journey, and by the time you reach your dwelling again, your shoulders burn with the familiar ache of repetitive labor. But there is no time to rest. Wood must be gathered for the fire that keeps your family alive. You venture out again, this time with a stone hatchet whose handle has been worn smooth by countless hands. Each piece of deadfall you collect represents a choice. Is it dry enough to burn cleanly? Is it free of rot that would produce choking smoke? Can you carry it back without making noise that might alert raiders to your location? Even gathering firewood becomes an exercise in strategy, a quiet test of judgment that could mean the difference between warmth and freezing, between concealment and discovery. The monotony of these tasks, water, wood, checking the snares you set for rabbits, grinding corn, repairing the endless small damages that daily life inflicts on tools and clothing, creates its own rhythm. Your hands move automatically through motions performed thousands of times before. There is a strange meditation in this repetition, a kind of peace that comes from work so familiar it requires no conscious thought. Your mind is free to wander while your body performs its duties, and in these quiet moments, you often find yourself scanning the horizon with eyes that never quite rest. Always, always, you are watching. The ability to detect danger before it arrives is not a skill you chose to develop. It is a requirement of staying alive. Your senses, honed by years of practice and necessity, pick up details that would escape notice in a softer world. The way birds suddenly stop singing in a particular direction. The feeling of being watched that prickles along your spine. The almost imperceptible change in the wind that carries new scents. Horse sweat from animals your people don't own. Unfamiliar smoke from fires that shouldn't be there. The metallic tang that seems to cling to the white settlers and their strange metal tools. When autumn arrives, the pace of life accelerates into controlled urgency. The buffalo hunts that will determine whether your people survive the winter require every able-bodied person to perform their role with perfect precision. You might spend days on horseback if your tribe has horses, or weeks on foot, tracking the great herds across distances that would humble a modern traveler. The hunt itself is a dance between life and death, not just for the buffalo but for you. One misstep, one moment of carelessness, and you could be trampled beneath thousands of hooves or gored by horns as sharp as spear points. But even successful hunts bring their own exhaustion. The butchering must be done quickly before the meat spoils. Your hands grow raw from wielding flint knives hour after hour, cutting the massive carcasses into pieces that can be dried, smoked, or immediately consumed. Your back screams from bending over your work, your arms ache from the repetitive motions of cutting and scraping, and your feet go numb from standing on the cold ground. Yet you cannot stop. Winter is coming, and every pound of meat preserved might mean the difference between survival and starvation for someone you love. The social pressures weigh on you as heavily as the physical demands. As a young warrior, you carry the expectations of your entire community on your shoulders. The elders watch your every move, ready to offer correction or worse, the kind of silence that speaks of disappointment. Your peers judge your courage, your skill, your worthiness to stand beside them when danger threatens. The young women of the village observe how you carry yourself, whether you flinch from challenges, whether your hands remain steady when others grow nervous. There is no privacy in this world, no moment when you can simply be yourself without consideration for how others perceive you. Every action is scrutinized, every word weighed for its wisdom or foolishness. If you show fear, you risk being labeled a coward. If you show too much confidence, you risk being seen as reckless. The narrow path between these extremes requires constant vigilance over your own thoughts and reactions, an exhausting internal discipline that never allows complete relaxation. The pressure to prove yourself manifests in countless small ways throughout each day. When the hunting party discusses which trail to follow, your opinion carries weight only if the others respect your judgment, and that respect must be earned again and again through consistent demonstration of skill and wisdom. When disputes arise in the village, your ability to contribute to the solution depends on whether the elders consider you mature enough to offer valuable insights. Even in moments of leisure, the games and contests that fill quiet evenings serve as subtle tests of your worthiness to be called a warrior. Sleep, when it finally comes, is rarely the deep, restorative rest that modern people take for granted. You lie on your reed mat with one part of your mind always alert for the sounds that might signal danger. The padding of unfamiliar feet around the village perimeter, the nervous nickering of horses sensing something wrong, the subtle change in the night, sounds that indicates predators, either animal or human, moving through the darkness. Your dreams, when they come, are often filled with the same anxieties that dominate your waking hours: failing in battle, letting down your family, facing starvation or cold, or the endless possibility of attack. The seasons wheel past in their eternal cycle, and with each turning, the challenges change but never diminish. Spring brings the exhausting work of planting and the vulnerability of having less stored food just when your body needs energy for the increased activity. Summer offers relative abundance, but also the threat of raids from enemy tribes who know your stores are full. Autumn demands the frantic preparation for winter's hardships, and winter itself tests every aspect of your resilience, physical, mental, and spiritual. And through it all, you endure, not because you are particularly heroic or noble, but because endurance is the price of existence. You wake each morning not knowing if you will see another sunset, not knowing if the day will bring abundance or scarcity, conflict or peace, joy or sorrow. You face each challenge with the same steady determination your people have cultivated for countless generations, not with excitement or eagerness, but with the quiet competence of someone who understands that survival is not a single dramatic act, but a series of small, careful decisions made day after day, year after year. Your life may not be glorious in the way that stories paint glory. There are no monuments erected to your patience, no songs sung about your daily courage, no histories written about the thousand small sacrifices you make to keep your people safe. But in the quiet moments between tasks, when you pause to watch the sun set over land that has known your ancestors for time beyond memory, you understand that your seemingly ordinary life is part of something larger, a continuous thread in the great weaving of your people's survival, a single note in the long song of endurance that stretches back to the beginning of time and forward into an uncertain future. And as the stars emerge overhead, the same stars your grandparents used to navigate through this same landscape, you settle into your robes for another night of watchful rest, knowing that tomorrow will bring the same challenges, the same quiet tests of strength and wisdom, the same opportunity to prove worthy of the life your ancestors struggled to preserve for you. The rhythm of your days continues, steady and eternal as the heartbeat of the earth itself. As the sun fades on our common warriors' daily struggles, let us shift our attention to a single life that rose from similar beginnings to cast a shadow across history. In the quiet hours before dawn, when mist rises from rivers and the world holds its breath between night and day, we find ourselves following the story of a man whose name still whispers across the Ohio Valley like wind through autumn leaves, Tecumseh. Even the sound of it carries weight, a Shawnee name meaning shooting star, as if his parents sensed that their son would blaze across the darkness of his people's most desperate hour, brilliant and brief as a meteor's path through the night sky. The very pronunciation of his name seemed to hold within it the essence of movement and light, of something that appears suddenly in the darkness, burns with impossible brightness, and leaves an afterimage that lingers long after the light itself has faded. He was born in 1768, in the season when leaves turn gold and red, in a world already trembling with change. The village of his birth sat along the banks of the Mad River in what is now Ohio, but which was then simply home, a place where the Shawnee had lived and hunted and raised their children for generations beyond counting. The Mad River itself seemed to carry in its name a prophecy of the turbulent times ahead, its waters flowing past Tecumseh's birthplace with the same restless energy that would characterize his entire existence. The longhouse where his mother labored to bring him into the world was filled with the same quiet sounds we have already known, the soft murmur of family voices, the crackle of the central fire, the gentle breathing of sleeping relatives. The structure itself was a testament to generations of accumulated wisdom, carefully selected saplings bent and bound to form a frame that could flex with the wind rather than break, bark covering that could be adjusted with the seasons, smoke holes positioned to draw properly regardless of weather conditions. Inside these walls, the rituals of birth unfolded as they had for countless generations. The women attendants who knew exactly when to offer encouragement and when to remain silent, the careful preparation of medicines from plants gathered at specific times and prepared according to knowledge passed down through an unbroken chain of mothers and grandmothers. But outside that peaceful dwelling, forces were already in motion that would shape every moment of Tecumseh's existence. To the east, beyond the great mountains that had long served as a natural barrier between worlds, people with pale skin and strange customs were multiplying like summer insects, their hunger for land growing with each passing season. They brought with them metal tools and weapons that could accomplish in hours what traditional implements required days to complete, animals the native peoples had never seen, horses that could carry a man farther in a day than he could walk in 3, cattle that could provide meat and milk in quantities that seemed to violate the natural balance of give and take that governed relationships between hunters and prey. Most alien of all, they brought a way of thinking about the earth that was as foreign as their language, the idea that land could be owned, bought, and sold like a tool or a weapon, rather than being something that belonged to all living creatures in the same way that air and water and sunlight belong to all. Imagine the boy Tecumseh in those early years, learning the same lessons our anonymous warrior absorbed. How to move silently through forest paths where a single, misplaced footstep might alert prey or predator. How to read the signs that spoke of approaching weather in the subtle changes of wind direction and the behavior of animals. How to find food when the stored corn ran low and winter stretched longer than expected. His small hands learned to shape arrowheads from flint, understanding through repetition and careful observation how the stone would fracture, which angles would produce the sharpest cutting edge, how to recognize flaws in the raw material that would make a point break at the critical moment when accuracy meant the difference between eating and going hungry. He learned to weave grass into snares for rabbits, to identify the plants that could heal and those that could kill, to recognize which mushrooms could safely be eaten and which would bring fever and death. His education was comprehensive in a way that formal schooling could never replicate. Every skill he acquired was immediately applicable to survival. Every piece of knowledge came with stories that connected it to the larger web of relationships that bound his people to their environment. When he learned to identify the call of the red-winged blackbird, he also learned that these birds nested in marshlands where certain medicinal plants grew, that their presence indicated water that was likely to be safe for drinking, that their migration patterns could help predict the coming of seasonal changes. His ears grew attuned to the sounds of his world, the call of specific birds that meant safety, the rustle of leaves that suggested hidden movement, the distant crack of branches that might indicate the approach of friends or enemies. But this acoustic education went far deeper than simple survival skills. He learned to distinguish between the footsteps of different animals, to identify individual people by the rhythm of their walking, to recognize the difference between wind moving through oak leaves and wind moving through maple, between the sound of rain beginning to fall and the sound of animals moving through wet underbrush. His world was one in which sound carried information that could save lives or reveal opportunities, where the ability to listen, really listen, was as important as the ability to see or speak. But even in childhood, something set Tecumseh apart from his playmates. Perhaps it was the way he listened when the elders spoke, his dark eyes fixed on their faces with an intensity that seemed too old for his years, as if he understood that he was receiving not just information, but something more precious. The accumulated wisdom of his ancestors, knowledge that might soon be lost if the forces pressing against his people continued their relentless advance. Perhaps it was his voice, already carrying a quality that made others pause and pay attention when he spoke, not because he demanded attention, but because something in his tone suggested that his words had been carefully considered and were worth hearing. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of the times he was born into, pressing down on him like a great hand, shaping him for the role he would eventually play. The other children of his generation could still play at war games with the innocent joy of those who had never seen real violence, could still imagine that the stories of the old days were simply entertainment rather than memories of a world that was disappearing. But Tecumseh seemed to carry within himself an awareness that childhood itself was a luxury his people could no longer afford, that the time for innocent games was passing as surely as summer gives way to autumn. When Tecumseh was 6 years old, his father died fighting Virginia militiamen at the Battle of Point Pleasant. The boy was too young to understand the larger forces at work, the way the new American colonies were pushing westward, claiming land that had belonged to native peoples since time immemorial. The complex legal and political structures that allowed settlers to arrive with documents written in a language the original inhabitants could not read, papers that somehow transformed their ancestral hunting grounds into private property that could be bought and sold. But he was old enough to understand that his father would never return from the hunt, never again sit by the fire telling stories of the old days when the Shawnee moved freely across their vast territory without interference from outsiders. The battle itself had been the culmination of months of growing tension as Virginia colonists pushed deeper into the Ohio River Valley, establishing settlements on land that the Shawnee considered their own. Point Pleasant, at the confluence of the Ohio and Kanawha rivers, had become a symbol of this conflict, a place where two different ways of understanding the relationship between humans and land met in violent collision. Tecumseh's father, Puckashinwau, had been a respected war chief known for his courage in battle and his wisdom in council. His death was not just a personal loss for his family, but a blow to the entire Shawnee nation, removing one of their most effective military leaders at a time when effective leadership was desperately needed. The loss carved something deep inside the young boy's heart. In the long evenings that followed, when other children played games and laughed with the easy joy of the very young, Tecumseh often sat quietly beside his mother, watching the flames dance and thinking thoughts that children should not have to think. The firelight would play across his face, illuminating features that were already beginning to show the strong bone structure and serious expression that would characterize his adult appearance, while his mind grappled with concepts that would have challenged men twice his age. How could his father, who had seemed so strong and capable, so permanent a fixture in the boy's small world, simply cease to exist? How could the balance of power that had governed relationships between different peoples for so long be shifting so rapidly that men like his father were dying in battles over land that had never been in dispute before? His mother, Methoataski, saw the change in her son and grieved for the carefree childhood that circumstances had stolen from him. She was a woman of remarkable strength, descended from a line of Creek women who had married into Shawnee families and brought with them their own traditions of resilience and adaptation. She understood that her son was growing up in a world fundamentally different from the one she had known as a child, and she tried to prepare him for challenges that she could sense approaching but could not fully articulate. She told him stories of his ancestors, not just the heroic tales that all children heard, but the more complex narratives of how the Shawnee had adapted to change before, how they had learned to survive in new territories, how they had forged alliances with former enemies when circumstances required it. As Tecumseh grew toward manhood, the pressures on his people intensified like water rising behind a dam, building toward some inevitable breaking point that everyone could sense but no one could predict. Treaty after treaty was signed and then broken, each one representing a moment of desperate hope followed by bitter disappointment. The pattern became numbingly familiar. Representatives of the United States government would arrive with solemn promises that this agreement would be different, that this line drawn on their maps would be permanent, that beyond this boundary the native peoples would be left in peace to live according to their traditional ways. But then, months or sometimes only weeks later, new settlers would appear, claiming that they had legal rights to land that had just been guaranteed to the tribes, carrying documents that somehow superseded the treaties that had been signed with such ceremony and apparent finality. Land that had been promised to the Shawnee forever was suddenly claimed by settlers who arrived with legal documents written in a language the native peoples could not read, papers that carried the authority of courts and governments that the tribes had never recognized and had never been asked to recognize. The concept of permanent ownership of specific parcels of land was so foreign to Shawnee thinking that many of them initially could not believe that the newcomers were serious. How could someone own the earth in the same way they might own a knife or a horse? How could anyone claim exclusive rights to places where their ancestors were buried, where sacred ceremonies had been conducted for generations, where the spirits of the land itself had been honored since the beginning of time? Villages that had existed for generations were abandoned overnight as their inhabitants fled westward, always westward, seeking some refuge that seemed to recede like the horizon itself. Each move meant leaving behind not just physical structures, but spiritual connections that had been generations in the making, sacred groves where important rituals were conducted, burial grounds where ancestors rested, springs and streams that held particular significance in tribal memory. The very landscape was a repository of cultural knowledge, each hill and valley associated with stories, ceremonies, and practical wisdom that could not easily be transferred to new locations. The young warrior, for Tecumseh had earned that title through the traditional tests of courage and skill, found himself caught between worlds that seemed impossible to reconcile. The tests he had undergone to earn recognition as an adult member of his society had been designed to prepare him for challenges that were already becoming obsolete. He had learned to endure physical hardship without complaint, to remain calm in the face of danger, to put the welfare of his community before his own comfort or safety. But these traditional virtues, while still valuable, were no longer sufficient to address the kinds of threats his people now faced. He learned to fight with both the traditional weapons of his ancestors, the bow and arrow, the war club, the knife, and the muskets that were increasingly common among his people. The firearms represented a troubling dependence on their enemies, requiring gunpowder and ammunition that could only be obtained through trade relationships that put the tribes at a permanent disadvantage. Yet the military effectiveness of these weapons could not be ignored, especially when facing opponents who had no such scruples about adopting new technologies. Tecumseh became skilled with both traditional and modern weapons, understanding that survival in his changing world required a willingness to adapt without losing sight of essential principles. He studied the tactics of European warfare while maintaining his deep connection to the spiritual practices that had guided the Shawnee for countless generations. European military doctrine emphasized formation fighting, with large groups of men moving in coordinated patterns across open battlefields, relying on discipline and firepower to overwhelm their opponents. Native American fighting traditions, by contrast, emphasized individual initiative, intimate knowledge of terrain, and the ability to appear and disappear like shadows in the forest. Tecumseh understood that his people would need to master both approaches, using European tactics when they offered advantages while retaining the guerrilla warfare skills that had served them well for centuries. He watched as some of his people adopted the customs of the invaders, wearing their clothes and living in their style of houses, learning to read and write in English, converting to Christianity, sending their children to schools where they were taught that their traditional ways were primitive and shameful. These adaptations were often motivated by a sincere belief that accommodation offered the best hope for survival, that by becoming as much like the newcomers as possible, native peoples might earn acceptance and a place in the new order that was emerging. But Tecumseh observed that even the most assimilated individuals were never fully accepted, that their efforts to transform themselves seemed only to earn contempt from those they were trying to please. Others retreated deeper into the old ways, as if tradition alone could protect them from the changes sweeping across their world. These conservatives rejected any contact with European culture, refusing to use metal tools or firearms, insisting that any compromise with the invaders would lead inevitably to complete cultural destruction. Their approach had a certain logical consistency. If European influence was inherently corrupting, then the only safe course was complete rejection. But Tecumseh could see that this strategy, however spiritually satisfying, was practically inadequate to the challenges his people faced. In council meetings that stretched deep into the night, Tecumseh listened to debate after debate about how his people should respond to the relentless pressure. The discussions were conducted according to traditional protocols that required every speaker to be heard with respect, regardless of how unpopular or impractical their proposals might seem. These meetings were exercises in collective decision-making that could last for days, as every aspect of proposed actions was examined from multiple perspectives, every possible consequence explored, every individual's concerns addressed. Some argued for accommodation, for finding ways to coexist with the newcomers by adopting their methods and accepting their authority. These advocates of compromise pointed to examples of native individuals who had found success by learning European ways, who had become prosperous traders or effective diplomats, who seemed to have found ways to preserve what was most important about their heritage while adapting to new circumstances. They argued that resistance was futile, that the newcomers were too numerous and too well armed to be defeated by force, that the only realistic option was to negotiate the best possible terms for survival. Others called for resistance, for fighting to the death rather than surrendering the ways of their ancestors. These voices spoke with the passion of people who had seen too much already lost, who believed that life without freedom and cultural integrity was not life worth living. They reminded the Council of the many treaty violations, the broken promises, the gradual erosion of native rights that seemed to accelerate with each act of accommodation. Better to die as free men and women, they argued, than to live as dependents in a world that had no place for their values or their way of life. Still others advocated for withdrawal, for moving ever westward until they found lands the white settlers had not yet reached. This strategy had the appeal of avoiding direct confrontation while preserving traditional ways of life, at least temporarily. The continent was vast, they argued, and surely there was room enough for different peoples to live according to their own customs without interfering with each other. But even the advocates of withdrawal had to acknowledge that this solution was temporary at best. The westward expansion of European settlement seemed inexorable, and eventually there would be nowhere left to retreat to. But as Tecumseh listened to these discussions, a different vision began to form in his mind, one that was both more ambitious and more desperate than any of the options being debated around the council fires. What if, instead of fighting alone or fleeing separately, the native peoples could unite? What if the ancient enmities between tribes could be set aside in the face of a threat that endangered them all equally? What if the scattered peoples of the forests, plains, and mountains could speak with one voice, negotiate from a position of strength rather than weakness? The idea was not entirely without precedent. The Iroquois Confederacy had demonstrated that traditional enemies could unite for mutual benefit, creating a political structure that had dominated the northeastern part of the continent for generations. But the Iroquois alliance had developed over centuries, built on shared cultural foundations and geographic proximity that did not exist among the much more diverse and scattered tribes that Tecumseh hoped to unite. His vision would require overcoming not just political differences but fundamental variations in language, religion, economic systems, and social organization. It was a dream that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. The Shawnee had warred with the Cherokee, the Creek with the Choctaw, the Iroquois with the Huron, for reasons stretching back beyond memory. These conflicts were woven into the very fabric of tribal identity, stories of ancient wrongs, competing claims to hunting territories, religious and cultural differences that seemed as immutable as the landscape itself. The idea of these traditional enemies laying aside their weapons and joining hands seemed as likely as convincing the wolf to hunt alongside the deer. But Tecumseh began to see past these old divisions to something larger, a shared identity as the original children of this continent, all facing the same existential threat. He understood that the differences between tribes, however significant they might seem to the people involved, were less important than what they had in common. They all shared a spiritual relationship with the land that was fundamentally different from European concepts of ownership and exploitation. They all had social and political systems based on consensus and reciprocity rather than hierarchy and competition. They all faced the same choice between cultural destruction and physical extinction. The task he set for himself would have daunted a man twice his age. He began to travel, moving from village to village, from tribe to tribe, carrying his message of unity like an ember carefully preserved through a long winter night. The logistics alone were staggering, traveling hundreds of miles on foot through territories where his presence might mean death if he encountered the wrong people, learning enough of different languages to communicate effectively with potential allies, understanding the complex political structures of dozens of different societies well enough to identify the real decision-makers and craft appeals that would resonate with their particular concerns and values. His reputation preceded him, stories of his courage in battle, his skill as a hunter, his wisdom in council, his refusal to torture prisoners or harm non-combatants. These stories were crucial to his success because they established his credibility before he ever opened his mouth to speak about unity. Native American societies placed enormous emphasis on personal character and proven ability, and no amount of eloquent rhetoric could substitute for a demonstrated record of integrity and effectiveness. When Tecumseh arrived in a village, people gathered to hear him speak, drawn by curiosity about this young Shawnee who dared to dream of uniting peoples who had been enemies since the world was young. Picture him in those moments, standing before a circle of warriors and elders whose weathered faces reflected skepticism, hope, fear, and calculation in equal measure. The settings varied. Sometimes a traditional council house with its carefully maintained fire and arrangement of seating that reflected complex protocols of respect and authority. Sometimes an informal gathering around an outdoor fire, sometimes a hastily arranged meeting in a temporary camp where refugees from some recent conflict had gathered to decide their next move. But always there was the same sense of momentous possibility hanging in the air, the feeling that something unprecedented was being attempted. His voice was not raised in passionate appeal. Passion burns hot and brief, and Tecumseh understood that what he sought required a deeper kind of conviction. Instead, he spoke quietly, logically, painting word pictures of what their children's world would look like if the native peoples continued to fight separately against an enemy that grew stronger with each passing season. He had studied his audiences carefully, learning their histories, their current difficulties, their particular strengths and weaknesses, and he crafted his appeals accordingly. To a tribe that prided itself on military prowess, he spoke of the tactical advantages of coordinated resistance. To people who had suffered recent losses, he offered the hope of mutual protection. To traditional enemies, he acknowledged past grievances while pointing toward future cooperation. The white man's hunger for land is like the hunger of fire for dry grass, he might say, his words carrying clearly in the still evening air. It consumes everything in its path and is never satisfied. We have all seen villages that we thought were safe disappear overnight, hunting grounds that our fathers promised us, forever taken by strangers who arrived with papers written in their own language. But fire can be stopped by water, by cleared ground, by people working together with a common purpose. Alone, each village, each tribe is like a single tree standing before a forest fire. Together, we could be the river that stops the flames. The metaphors he chose were drawn from the natural world that all his listeners understood intimately, comparisons that made abstract political concepts concrete and immediate. He spoke of the way individual animals might be helpless against predators that could be driven off by a pack working together, of the way streams that seemed insignificant when considered separately could become mighty rivers when they joined their waters. His imagery was simple but profound, rooted in observations that anyone who had lived close to the land would recognize as true. Night after night, in villages scattered across what would become the American Midwest and South, Tecumseh wove his vision of unity. He spoke in different languages, adapted his message to different tribal traditions, but always returned to the same central truth. Divided, they would fall one by one. United, they might survive. The languages he had to master were not just different vocabularies, but entirely different ways of organizing thought and expressing complex ideas. Some tribes had elaborate systems for indicating social relationships within the structure of every sentence. Others had developed sophisticated methods for incorporating spiritual concepts into practical discussions. Tecumseh had to become not just multilingual, but multicultural, learning to think and speak in ways that would resonate with the deepest values and assumptions of his diverse audiences. Some listened with growing excitement, seeing in his words the hope they had been searching for without knowing how to name it. These early converts became invaluable allies, carrying Tecumseh's message to villages he could not visit personally, serving as living examples that traditional enemies could indeed work together for common purposes. Their enthusiasm was contagious, spreading through kinship networks and trading relationships in ways that multiplied Tecumseh's individual efforts exponentially. Others remained unconvinced, bound by ancient loyalties and suspicions that ran deeper than rational argument. These skeptics were not necessarily wrong. They could point to countless examples of alliances that had failed, promises that had been broken, ambitious plans that had ended in disaster for those who believed in them. Their caution was born of hard experience and genuine concern for their people's welfare, not simple stubbornness or lack of vision. Tecumseh understood that their resistance was often rooted in love rather than fear, in a determination to protect their communities from what they saw as dangerous gambles with uncertain outcomes. The slow work of building alliances consumed years of Tecumseh's life, years when other men his age were establishing themselves in their communities, marrying, having children, accumulating the possessions and relationships that gave life meaning and stability. He traveled thousands of miles on foot and horseback, crossing territories where his presence meant death if he encountered the wrong people. The physical hardships were considerable, sleeping rough in all kinds of weather, finding food and shelter in unfamiliar territories, maintaining his health and strength despite the constant stress of dangerous travel and diplomatic tension. But the psychological challenges were even greater. He was asking people to trust him not just with their lives, but with their entire way of existence, to gamble their cultural survival on his vision of what might be possible. The responsibility was crushing. Every decision he made, every promise he offered, every alliance he negotiated had consequences that extended far beyond his personal fate to encompass the futures of entire peoples. The weight of this responsibility never left him, following him into his dreams, shaping every conversation, coloring every moment of apparent rest or relaxation. He negotiated not just with tribal leaders, but with the complex web of relationships that bound native communities together, the clan mothers who held real power in many tribes, the medicine men whose spiritual authority could not be ignored, the war chiefs whose followers looked to them for protection and guidance. Understanding these power structures required not just political acumen, but deep cultural sensitivity, the ability to recognize and respect forms of authority that might be invisible to outsiders, but were absolutely crucial to anyone who hoped to effect real change. The clan mothers, in particular, represented a form of influence that European observers often failed to recognize or understand. In many tribes, these senior women held the ultimate authority over decisions about war and peace, about the selection and removal of chiefs, about the distribution of resources and the maintenance of social harmony. They derived their power not from military prowess or oratorical skill, but from their roles as the keepers of cultural knowledge, the arbiters of proper behavior, the voices of collective wisdom. Winning their support required demonstrating not just the practical advantages of unity, but its compatibility with traditional values and proper ways of living. In quiet moments between these diplomatic missions, when he camped alone under stars that had watched over his ancestors since the beginning of time, Tecumseh must have felt the enormous weight of what he was attempting. The vastness of the night sky above him served as a reminder of the scale of the forces he was trying to influence, the countless individual lives and communities that would be affected by the success or failure of his efforts. The stars themselves seemed to offer both comfort and challenge, comfort in their permanence and beauty, challenge in their reminder that human struggles, however important they might seem to those involved in them, were small things in the larger scheme of creation. He was not just trying to forge military alliances, he was asking entire peoples to reimagine their place in the world, to see themselves as part of something larger than their traditional tribal boundaries. The transformation he envisioned was as profound as anything attempted in human history, comparable to the great religious or philosophical movements that had reshaped entire civilizations. He was attempting to create a new kind of identity, while the foundations of the old world crumbled beneath his feet, to build a house while the ground itself was shifting and unstable. The personal cost of this mission pressed down on him like a physical burden, growing heavier with each passing year. While other men his age were raising families, building homes, settling into the rhythms of domestic life, Tecumseh remained perpetually in motion, always traveling toward the next council, the next opportunity to spread his message of unity. The loneliness was profound, not just the physical solitude of long journeys through empty wilderness, but the deeper isolation of carrying a vision that few others fully understood, of bearing responsibility for outcomes that were always uncertain. He never married, never had children of his own, dedicating every aspect of his existence to the cause that consumed him. This sacrifice was particularly significant in cultures that placed enormous value on family relationships and the continuation of lineage. By remaining unmarried, Tecumseh was not just denying himself personal happiness, but cutting himself off from one of the primary sources of meaning and identity in his society. His family became the confederation he was trying to build, his children the future generations who might benefit from the unity he hoped to achieve. By 1811, after more than a decade of patient diplomacy, Tecumseh had succeeded in creating something that had never existed before, a loose confederation of native peoples stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. It was fragile, held together more by hope than by formal structures, but it represented a genuine possibility that the scattered tribes might present a united front against American expansion. The Confederation included not just traditional allies, but former enemies who had agreed to set aside ancient grievances for the sake of survival. The diversity of the alliance was both its greatest strength and its most serious weakness. It demonstrated that Tecumseh's vision of unity could transcend traditional boundaries, that peoples with different languages, religions, and social systems could indeed find common ground. But this same diversity made coordination difficult and created numerous opportunities for misunderstanding and conflict. Each member tribe brought its own priorities, its own internal politics, its own interpretation of what unity should look like in practice. But even as his dream took shape, forces beyond his control were conspiring to destroy it. His younger brother, Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, had established a village at the confluence of the Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers in Indiana Territory. This settlement, called Prophetstown, was intended to serve as a symbol of native unity and resistance to American influence. The Prophet had experienced a spiritual awakening that convinced him that native peoples had been corrupted by contact with European culture and could only regain their strength by returning to traditional ways of life. Rejecting alcohol, European tools, and other influences that he believed had weakened them spiritually and politically. Prophetstown quickly became a gathering place for native people from many different tribes who were attracted by the Prophet's message of spiritual renewal and cultural purification. The town represented a different approach to the same problems that Tecumseh was trying to address through political and military organization. Where Tecumseh emphasized unity and strategic thinking, the Prophet focused on spiritual transformation and cultural revival. The two approaches were not necessarily incompatible, but they attracted different kinds of followers and created different expectations about how native peoples should respond to the challenges they faced. The growth of Prophetstown alarmed American officials who saw it as a potential center for hostile activity and a dangerous example of native independence. William Henry Harrison, the territorial governor of Indiana, was particularly concerned about the concentration of warriors from different tribes in a single location, fearing that they might be planning coordinated attacks on American settlements. The presence of the Prophet, with his anti-American rhetoric and his calls for rejection of European influence, only intensified these fears. But in November 1811, while Tecumseh was away recruiting southern tribes to his confederation, American forces under William Henry Harrison attacked and destroyed the village. The attack came at the worst possible moment. Tecumseh was hundreds of miles away, trying to convince the Creek and Cherokee nations to join his alliance, when he should have been present to provide the military leadership that might have prevented the disaster. The timing was not accidental. Harrison had been waiting for exactly such an opportunity when the most capable native military leader was absent and the settlement was most vulnerable. The battle itself was relatively small in scale, but its psychological and political impact was enormous. Prophetstown had been more than just a village. It was a symbol of native resistance and self-determination, a place where people from different tribes had come together to live according to traditional values while preparing for the struggles ahead. Its destruction sent a clear message that American authorities would not tolerate any form of organized native opposition, that even peaceful settlements could be targeted if they represented challenges to American expansion. The news reached Tecumseh like a physical blow, striking at the very heart of everything he had been working toward. Years of careful work, delicate negotiations, and slowly built trust had been undone in a single morning's violence. The confederation he had spent his adult life creating began to fracture as individual tribes decided they could no longer afford to associate themselves with what many now saw as a lost cause. The destruction of Prophetstown seemed to prove that American power was too great to be resisted, that any attempt at unified opposition would only bring destruction down on those who participated in it. The psychological impact on Tecumseh himself was devastating. He had always known that his mission carried enormous risks, but he had believed that careful planning and gradual organization could minimize those risks while building toward eventual success. The attack on Prophetstown demonstrated that American officials were not willing to allow such planning to continue, that they would strike preemptively against any sign of organized resistance. The loss was not just strategic, but deeply personal. Many of the people killed or displaced in the attack were individuals he had worked with closely, allies who had trusted his judgment and followed his leadership. Yet Tecumseh did not abandon his dream. The destruction of Prophetstown was a severe blow, but it did not fundamentally alter the underlying situation that had motivated his quest for unity in the first place. American expansion was continuing regardless of native resistance or accommodation, and the choice facing his people remained the same: unite and fight for their survival, or face destruction separately and helplessly. If anything, the attack on Prophetstown demonstrated the urgency of his mission, the need for native peoples to present a unified front before it was too late. When the War of 1812 broke out between the United States and Britain, he saw one final opportunity to secure his people's future. If the native confederation could ally with the British and help them defeat the Americans, perhaps the Western Territories could be preserved as a permanent homeland for the original inhabitants of the continent. The war represented exactly the kind of opportunity that Tecumseh had been working toward, a chance for native peoples to play a decisive role in determining the future of North America, to negotiate from a position of strength rather than weakness. The decision to side with the British was not made lightly. Tecumseh had no particular love for European powers. He understood that British claims to friendship with native peoples were based on strategic convenience rather than genuine respect. The British had their own imperial ambitions, their own plans for North America that might not include much space for independent native nations. But the Americans had made their intentions clear through decades of broken treaties and relentless westward expansion, through attacks like the one on Prophetstown that demonstrated their unwillingness to coexist peacefully with any form of native resistance. The British at least offered the possibility of a negotiated settlement that might preserve some space for native peoples in the continent of their birth. They had practical reasons for wanting to limit American expansion, and they were willing to promise support for native rights in exchange for military assistance. The promises might prove as empty as American treaty commitments had been, but they represented the only hope available for achieving the kind of political settlement that could guarantee native survival. The war years that followed tested every aspect of Tecumseh's leadership. He fought alongside British forces in battles across the Great Lakes region, always working to hold together the fragile alliance that represented his people's last hope for survival as independent nations. The military challenges were complex, coordinating between British regular troops and native warriors who had completely different fighting styles and tactical approaches, maintaining morale among allies who often had little understanding of each other's motivations and methods, adapting traditional native warfare techniques to the requirements of European-style battles. His presence in battle was like a steady flame in darkness. Soldiers on both sides reported that he seemed to move through combat with an almost supernatural calm, as if protected by forces beyond the reach of bullets and bayonets. This reputation for invulnerability was crucial to his effectiveness as a military leader because it gave his followers confidence in his judgment and his cause. Warriors who might have fled from hopeless situations remained and fought because they believed that Tecumseh's presence guaranteed eventual victory, that his spiritual power could overcome material disadvantages. But the strains of warfare, combined with the fundamental weaknesses in the British-Native alliance, gradually wore away at Tecumseh's Confederation. British commanders, despite their promises of respect and partnership, often treated native warriors as expendable auxiliaries rather than equal allies. They expected native forces to follow European military discipline and tactics without understanding or respecting the cultural values that made such approaches problematic for many native fighters. The result was constant friction between allied forces that should have been cooperating smoothly against their common enemy. American propaganda painted the native fighters as savages and tools of foreign powers, rather than as people defending their homeland. This characterization served multiple purposes. It dehumanized native resistance, making it easier for American forces to fight without moral qualms, while also delegitimizing native political aspirations by suggesting that they were not genuine expressions of indigenous will, but merely the products of British manipulation. The narrative was both convenient and effective, allowing Americans to see themselves as fighting foreign aggression rather than engaging in the conquest of other people's territories. The complex web of tribal relationships that Tecumseh had so carefully cultivated began to unravel under the pressure of competing loyalties and immediate survival needs. Tribes that had agreed to cooperate in principle found it difficult to coordinate their actions in practice, especially when separated by hundreds of miles and facing different immediate threats. Communication between distant allies became increasingly difficult as American forces gained control of more territory, making it dangerous or impossible for messengers to travel between scattered native communities. The cultural differences that Tecumseh had managed to bridge through personal diplomacy became sources of friction when he was not present to mediate between conflicting viewpoints. Tribes with different military traditions found it difficult to fight together effectively, while groups with different political structures struggled to reach consensus about strategy and objectives. The Confederation that had seemed so promising in peaceful council meetings proved fragile under the stress of actual warfare, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Meanwhile, the British alliance that had seemed to offer so much hope revealed its own limitations and contradictions. British military commanders, trained in European warfare and unfamiliar with North American conditions, often made tactical decisions that ignored the expertise of their native allies. They deployed forces according to conventional European strategic thinking, without understanding how those deployments affected the complex network of relationships and obligations that held native alliances together. The result was a series of missed opportunities and strategic blunders that weakened the very confederation they were supposedly supporting. The British supply system, stretched thin across vast distances and constantly disrupted by American naval power, proved unable to provide the reliable flow of weapons, ammunition, and other necessities that native forces required. This logistical weakness forced native warriors to rely increasingly on traditional weapons and tactics, even when facing American forces equipped with the latest military technology. The disparity in equipment became a source of bitter resentment, as native allies felt that they were being asked to bear the heaviest burdens of the war while receiving the least support. Economic factors also played an increasingly important role in undermining native unity. The war disrupted traditional trading relationships that many tribes depended on for essential goods, forcing them to choose between loyalty to the Confederation and the immediate survival needs of their own people. Some tribes found they could obtain better terms by negotiating separately with American officials, who were always eager to divide their opponents by offering attractive deals to potential defectors. The temptation to abandon a costly and uncertain alliance in favor of immediate benefits proved irresistible for many communities that had already suffered enormous losses. Personal rivalries and long-standing resentments, temporarily suppressed in the excitement of creating something new, began to resurface under the pressure of military setbacks and material hardships. Chiefs who had agreed to follow Tecumseh's leadership in peaceful councils found it difficult to subordinate their own judgment to his when their warriors were dying in battles that seemed to accomplish nothing. The democratic traditions of many native societies, which required consensus for major decisions, made rapid responses to changing military situations nearly impossible when different leaders disagreed about appropriate tactics. The American strategy of targeting native communities rather than just military forces put enormous pressure on tribal leaders who had to balance their commitment to the Confederation against their responsibility to protect their own people. Raids on native villages, destruction of crops and food supplies, and deliberate targeting of non-combatants forced many chiefs to withdraw from the broader conflict to defend their immediate communities. This defensive focus, while completely understandable from a humanitarian perspective, had the strategic effect of fragmenting native resistance and allowing American forces to defeat their opponents piecemeal. Tecumseh found himself fighting not just against American military forces, but against the centrifugal forces that were pulling his Confederation apart. He traveled constantly between different theaters of war, trying to maintain personal relationships with allied chiefs, resolving disputes between different tribal groups, and providing the kind of inspirational leadership that could motivate discouraged warriors to continue fighting against increasingly hopeless odds. The physical and emotional toll of this constant activity was enormous, but he understood that his personal presence was often the only thing holding the alliance together. The spiritual dimension of native resistance, which had been so important in the early stages of the Confederation, became increasingly problematic as military defeats accumulated. The Prophet's teachings had promised that traditional spiritual practices would provide protection against American weapons, but battlefield experience seemed to contradict these assurances. Warriors who had entered battle confident that their spiritual preparation would ensure victory found themselves facing very material bullets and bayonets that showed no respect for ceremonial preparation or ritual purity. The resulting crisis of faith undermined not just military morale, but the entire cultural foundation on which Tecumseh's vision of unity had been built. The seasonal rhythms that had traditionally governed native life came into conflict with the demands of continuous warfare. Many tribes were accustomed to fighting during specific seasons, while devoting other times of year to hunting, farming, and other essential activities. The European model of warfare, with its emphasis on year-round campaigning and permanent military forces, required a level of commitment that was difficult to sustain within traditional native social structures. Warriors who were needed for battles were also needed for hunting expeditions that would provide food for their families during the coming winter, creating impossible choices between military and survival priorities. As the war progressed, and the strategic situation deteriorated, Tecumseh was forced to watch his carefully constructed confederation dissolve before his eyes. Tribal delegations that had once proclaimed their eternal loyalty began arriving at his camp to announce their withdrawal from the alliance, usually accompanied by elaborate explanations about why their people's immediate needs required them to make separate peace arrangements with American authorities. Each defection weakened the Confederation both materially and psychologically, reducing its military effectiveness while encouraging other wavering allies to reconsider their own commitments. The British, increasingly focused on their European war against Napoleon and less interested in their American colonies, began to reduce their support for native allies who seemed unable to achieve decisive victories against American forces. British officials who had once spoken eloquently about their respect for native rights and their commitment to permanent alliance began to hint that any eventual peace settlement might require native peoples to make significant concessions in exchange for American recognition of British interests elsewhere. The gradual abandonment by their supposed allies added another layer of bitterness to the military defeats that were becoming increasingly common. On October 5, 1813, at the Battle of the Thames in Ontario, the thread that held Tecumseh's world together finally snapped. The British forces, outnumbered and outmaneuvered by American troops under William Henry Harrison, broke and ran from the battlefield almost as soon as the fighting began. The collapse was so sudden and complete that it left their native allies completely exposed, facing overwhelming American forces without the support they had been promised and counting on. Tecumseh, fighting with a small band of native warriors who refused to retreat, found himself in exactly the situation he had spent his entire adult life trying to avoid: isolated, outnumbered, and facing an enemy that had no interest in negotiating or showing mercy. The irony was bitter. The man who had dedicated his life to preventing native peoples from fighting alone was himself abandoned by his allies in his moment of greatest need. Yet, even in these desperate circumstances, he continued to fight with the same calm determination that had characterized his entire career, as if the principles he had lived by were more important than the practical consequences of maintaining them. He was killed in the fighting that followed, though the exact circumstances of his death became the subject of competing narratives that reflected the different perspectives of those who witnessed or later learned about the battle. American accounts emphasized the decisive nature of their victory and the elimination of their most dangerous opponent, while native oral histories focused on Tecumseh's courage and his refusal to surrender, even when defeat was certain. British reports, when they mentioned the battle at all, tended to downplay their own role in the disaster and emphasize the impossible odds their forces had faced. His death was like the extinguishing of a star, sudden, final, and leaving behind a darkness that seemed all the deeper for the light that had preceded it. The metaphor was particularly appropriate for a man whose name meant shooting star, whose brief but brilliant career had illuminated possibilities that seemed to die with him. With Tecumseh gone, the dream of native unity died as well, not because the dream itself was flawed, but because no one else possessed the unique combination of vision, charisma, and practical political skill necessary to hold such a diverse and fractious coalition together. The confederation he had spent his life building dissolved as individual tribes sought the best terms they could negotiate for themselves, or simply fled westward toward territories that seemed, at least temporarily, beyond the reach of American expansion. The process was heartbreakingly familiar, the same pattern of fragmentation and retreat that had characterized native responses to European expansion for centuries, the same inability to maintain unity in the face of external pressure that had made such expansion possible in the first place. Some of Tecumseh's former allies attempted to continue his work, to maintain at least portions of the confederation he had created, but they lacked both his personal authority and his strategic vision. The complex network of relationships he had spent decades building could not survive the loss of the individual who had been its primary architect and mediator. Without his constant traveling, negotiating, and persuading, the natural centrifugal forces that pulled different tribes toward their own immediate interests quickly reasserted themselves. The American victory at the Thames effectively ended organized native resistance east of the Mississippi River, opening vast territories for settlement that had previously been contested. The psychological impact was as important as the military result. Native peoples throughout the region understood that their most effective leader was dead and their most promising strategy had failed. The hope that Tecumseh had kindled during his years of diplomatic and military activity was replaced by a resigned acceptance that accommodation or flight were the only realistic options remaining. In the end, Tecumseh's story is one of magnificent failure, a life dedicated to a vision that was perhaps too large for the time and circumstances that produced it. He saw clearly what his people needed to survive in a changing world, but the forces arrayed against that survival were too powerful to be overcome by even the most brilliant leadership and the most compelling dream of unity. The window of opportunity for successful native resistance was already closing when he began his work, and despite his extraordinary efforts, he was unable to reverse trends that had been developing for generations. The personal tragedy of his story lies not just in his death, but in the gap between his vision and his ability to realize it. He understood better than any of his contemporaries what needed to be done to preserve native independence and cultural integrity, but he lacked the resources, material, political, and temporal, necessary to transform understanding into effective action. His failure was not a failure of imagination or leadership, but a failure of circumstances, a demonstration of how even the most exceptional individuals can be overwhelmed by historical forces beyond their control. Yet there is something in his story that transcends the simple measurement of success and failure. In those quiet moments when he stood before council fires and spoke of a future where the native peoples of North America might determine their own destiny, he embodied a kind of hope that was its own form of victory. He proved that even in the darkest hours, when the forces of history seem aligned against everything you hold dear, it is possible to envision a different future and to dedicate your life to making that vision real. His legacy lies not in the Confederation that died with him, but in the example he set of principled resistance to overwhelming odds. He demonstrated that dignity and integrity could be maintained even in defeat, that it was possible to fight for justice without abandoning moral principles. That leadership could be based on service to others rather than personal advancement. These lessons outlived the specific circumstances that produced them, inspiring later generations of leaders who faced their own seemingly impossible challenges. The vision of unity that Tecumseh articulated, the idea that people from different backgrounds could work together for common goals despite their differences, proved to be ahead of its time but not fundamentally flawed. Later movements for social justice and political reform would rediscover many of his insights about the power of coalition building and the necessity of looking beyond narrow self-interest toward broader community welfare. His strategic thinking about the need to address root causes rather than symptoms, to build sustainable alliances rather than temporary expedients, became part of the intellectual foundation for subsequent efforts at social and political transformation. As we let his story settle into the quiet corners of our minds, we can almost hear the echo of his voice across the centuries, calm, measured, never quite giving up hope that tomorrow might bring the change that yesterday seemed impossible to achieve. His life reminds us that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in winning, but in continuing to fight for what is right, even when victory appears impossible, in lighting a candle even when darkness seems absolute and eternal. The shooting star that was Tecumseh blazed across the night sky of American history for only 45 years, but its light revealed possibilities that continue to inspire and challenge us. he showed that it is possible to maintain hope without illusion, to work for change without guarantees of success, to remain faithful to principles even when those principles offer no immediate practical advantages. In a world that often rewards compromise and accommodation, his example reminds us that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the odds, that integrity itself can be a form of victory that survives long after particular battles have been lost. His story speaks to the eternal human struggle between the world as it is and the world as it might be, between the practical necessities of survival and the deeper requirements of meaning and purpose. Tecumseh chose to live according to his vision of what was right rather than what was expedient, and in doing so he created a legacy that outlasted the Confederation he died trying to preserve. His name continues to whisper across the Ohio Valley like wind through autumn leaves, carrying with it the memory of a man who dared to dream of unity in a world determined to remain divided, who chose hope over despair, even when hope seemed the least reasonable of all possible choices. Let us now drift from the life of one remarkable man into the realm of mystery, where the earth itself holds secrets that archaeologists still whisper about in hushed tones. As evening deepens around us, imagine yourself walking through an Ohio valley where morning mist clings to ancient earthworks, where the ground beneath your feet rises and falls in patterns that speak of human intention from 1,000 years past. The air carries the scent of wild grasses and distant wood smoke, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, an owl calls across waters that have flowed between these earthen walls since before memory began. Here, in the quiet spaces between what we know and what we can only wonder about, lie the silent fortifications of Native America, defenses so subtle, so interwoven with the landscape and the spirit world, that European eyes often failed to recognize them as military installations at all. These were not the towering stone castles of medieval Europe, built to impress and intimidate with their brutal geometry of dominance. These were something far more mysterious, earthworks that curved like serpents across river valleys, wooden palisades that appeared and vanished like morning fog, and defensive systems that existed as much in the realm of the sacred as in the world of warfare. The very concept of fortification meant something different to the peoples who shaped these landscapes. Where European military architects sought to dominate terrain through sheer vertical presence, native builders worked with the natural contours of the earth, creating defenses that seemed to emerge organically from hills and valleys. Their walls breathed with the rhythm of seasons, expanding and contracting as timber aged, and earth settled, becoming more integrated with their surroundings rather than more separate from them. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the great Serpent Mound, that enormous earthen sculpture that winds for more than a quarter-mile through the hills of southern Ohio. In the soft light of dawn, with dew still clinging to the grass that covers its ancient curves, it appears almost to be breathing. A massive snake frozen in the act of swallowing an egg, or perhaps a cosmic symbol whose meaning has been lost to time. The silence here is profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through prairie grass and the distant murmur of Brush Creek winding through the valley below. Archaeological evidence tells us it was built by the Fort ancient people sometime between 1000 and 1200 CE, but the evidence cannot tell us why. Carbon dating can fix the approximate age of charcoal fragments found in the earthwork, but it cannot capture the discussions that must have taken place around countless fires as the community planned this massive undertaking. We can measure the precise astronomical alignments of its curves, but we cannot hear the prayers that were spoken as each basketful of earth was carried to its appointed place. Was it a fortification? The location suggests defensive possibilities. Built on a plateau overlooking Brush Creek, it commands a view of the surrounding countryside that would have allowed sentries to spot approaching enemies from miles away. Yet there are no obvious military features, no evidence of palisades or weapons caches or the debris of battle. Instead, there is only this sinuous earthwork, following astronomical alignments with a precision that speaks of careful observation and sacred purpose. The mound's head points toward the summer solstice sunset, while its coils align with the major lunar standstills, a celestial calendar written in earth and grass. But perhaps this absence of conventional military features is itself a clue. The Serpent Mound may have been a fortification of the spirit rather than the body, a massive prayer for protection that drew its defensive power from its harmony with cosmic forces rather than from walls and weapons. In many Native American traditions, the serpent is a symbol of transformation and renewal, of the life force that flows through all creation. A community that built such a monument was declaring its intention to remain in balance with these fundamental energies, to protect itself through spiritual alignment rather than physical force alone. This is the mystery that runs through so many Native American defensive works. The line between the practical and the spiritual, between military necessity and cosmic harmony, was not a line at all, but a flowing river where one purpose merged seamlessly into another. To understand how these peoples defended themselves, we must understand that they saw no separation between protecting their bodies and protecting their souls, between building walls against human enemies and maintaining harmony with the invisible forces that governed all existence. The very materials used in these constructions reflect this integration of purposes. Earth was not merely a building material, but a living substance, the body of the mother from whom all life emerged. Wood was not simply timber, but the transformed essence of trees that had stood as witnesses to countless seasons, their annual rings holding memories of droughts and floods, of peaceful years and times of conflict. Stone was not just structural material, but the bones of ancient mountains, repositories of power and permanence that could anchor human intentions in the bedrock of eternity. Consider the great earthwork complexes at Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, where at its height around 1100 CE, perhaps 20,000 people lived in the largest city north of Mexico. The site is dominated by Monk's Mound, a massive earthen pyramid that rises over 100 feet above the surrounding floodplain. From its summit, the view stretches for miles in every direction, a perfect vantage point for watching the approaches to the city. On clear days, lookouts stationed there could see smoke from distant villages, track the movement of large groups across the prairie, and spot the flash of sunlight on water that might indicate the approach of war parties traveling by river. But Monk's Mound was not simply a watchtower, it was the center of a vast ceremonial complex, aligned with the movements of the sun and stars, serving as both a connection to the divine and a demonstration of earthly power. The message it sent to potential enemies was not merely, "We are strong," but "We are in harmony with forces beyond your understanding." It was a fortification built as much of awe and mystery as of earth and timber. The very act of constructing such a monument required the coordinated labor of thousands of people over many years, a demonstration of social cohesion that may have been more intimidating to potential enemies than any wall or weapon. The pyramid slopes were carefully engineered to maintain their angle of repose through centuries of rain and frost, its drainage systems designed to channel water away from the structure without eroding its foundations. Yet these practical considerations were interwoven with ceremonial requirements, terraces that served as platforms for rituals, stairways oriented toward significant celestial events, chambers within the mound that may have served as spaces for spiritual retreat or the storage of sacred objects. The defensive works that surrounded Cahokia tell a similar story. A great wooden palisade, rebuilt several times over the centuries, enclosed the central ceremonial area. Archaeological excavation has revealed the post-molds of these ancient walls, showing us that they were constructed with sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture. The palisade was not a simple fence but a complex fortification system, with bastions projecting at regular intervals to eliminate blind spots and provide crossing fields of fire for archers stationed along the walls. But this was not a simple wall. It was punctuated by bastions spaced at regular intervals, designed with an understanding of defensive architecture that rivaled anything in contemporary Europe. The builders demonstrated knowledge of flanking fire, overlapping fields of observation, and the psychological effects of imposing barriers. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that the palisade also served ceremonial functions, with gates oriented towards significant astronomical events and openings that allowed for processional routes during important religious festivals. The gates themselves were architectural poems combining defensive necessity with spiritual symbolism. Some were simple openings, easily barricaded in times of danger. Others were elaborate structures that forced approaching visitors to follow serpentine paths, moving them slowly through spaces where they could be observed and evaluated. These indirect approaches served both military and ceremonial purposes. They allowed defenders time to assess the intentions of visitors while creating a sense of transition from the ordinary world outside to the sacred space within. The timber used in these palisades came from carefully selected trees chosen not only for their structural properties, but for their spiritual significance: oak for strength and endurance, cedar for purification and protection, ash for flexibility and resilience. The felling of these trees would have been accompanied by ceremonies of gratitude and propitiation, acknowledgements that the life of the forest was being transformed into the protection of the community. As we drift deeper into this world of hidden defenses, imagine yourself in the forests of the Northeast, where the Haudenosaunee, the people Europeans called the Iroquois, developed perhaps the most sophisticated defensive systems in pre-Columbian North America. Their hilltop villages were protected by multiple rings of wooden palisades, often triple-walled with earth and stone barriers between them. These fortifications rose from carefully cleared hilltops like wooden crowns, their pointed stakes creating jagged silhouettes against the sky. But even these obvious fortifications were integrated into a larger defensive philosophy that extended far beyond the physical walls. The placement of villages followed strategic principles that took advantage of natural terrain features: hills that commanded river crossings, peninsulas that could be easily defended, locations that controlled access to important resource areas. The cleared fields around each village served multiple purposes. They provided agricultural land, created kill zones where attacking enemies would be exposed to defensive fire, and offered unobstructed views of the surrounding landscape. The true strength of Haudenosaunee defense lay not in any single fortification, but in a network of alliances, intelligence gathering, and strategic mobility that stretched across hundreds of miles. Warriors could travel the ancient paths through the forest with a speed that amazed European observers, appearing suddenly where they were least expected, melting away into the wilderness when pursuit seemed likely. Their defensive system was like a spider's web, invisible to casual observation, but capable of detecting the slightest disturbance across vast distances. These forest highways were marvels of engineering, maintained by generations of travelers who understood the subtle art of moving through woodland without leaving obvious traces. The paths followed ridgelines to avoid swampy ground, crossed streams at natural fords, and were marked by blazes carved into trees according to systems that could be read by allied travelers but remained meaningless to enemies. Rest stops were established at regular intervals, often in locations that offered natural shelter and fresh water, creating a network of safe havens for friendly forces while remaining hidden from hostile observation. At the heart of this network were the signal fires, chains of smoke that could carry messages across continents in a matter of hours. From mountaintop to mountaintop, thin columns of smoke rose against the sky, their patterns as carefully coded as any written language. A single puff might mean all is well. 3 puffs in quick succession could indicate approaching enemies. Complex combinations could convey detailed information about the size and nature of threats, the movement of friendly forces, or calls for assistance from allied villages. The fire tenders who maintained these communication systems were specialists whose knowledge was passed down through generations of careful training. They understood not only the codes, but the subtle art of creating smoke signals that would be visible to intended recipients while remaining inconspicuous to potential enemies. The timing of signals was coordinated with natural phenomena. Smoke rising at dawn might blend with morning mist, while signals sent during periods of natural haze could avoid detection by hostile observers. But like so much else in Native American defensive practice, these signal fires served purposes beyond mere military communication. They were also spiritual practices, prayers made visible as smoke rose toward the realm of the spirits. The fires were often tended by individuals chosen for their spiritual insight as much as their military knowledge, people who understood that protecting the community required maintaining proper relationships with forces both seen and unseen. The wood burned in these fires was carefully selected for its spiritual properties as well as its smoke-producing characteristics, with different species chosen for different types of messages. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the mist rises from rivers and lakes across the continent, we can almost imagine these ancient signal systems still functioning. Thin columns of smoke drifting up from hidden valleys, carrying messages in a language that modern eyes can no longer read. The smoke dissipates in the morning air, but the mountains that once supported these communication networks still stand, still watching over landscapes where the descendants of those early defenders continue to make their homes. The seasonal patterns of these defensive systems reflected deep understanding of the rhythms of conflict and peace. Summer was the season of warfare, when travel was easiest, and crops did not require constant attention. It was during these months that the signal fires burned most frequently, carrying news of war parties and raiding expeditions across the network of allied villages. But winter brought a different kind of vigilance, a season when communities turned inward to repair weapons, tell the stories of past conflicts, and train young people in the arts of defense. Moving westward in our imagination, we encounter the mesa-top pueblos of the southwest, where defensive architecture merged so completely with the natural landscape that villages seemed to grow from the living rock itself. The great cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, built by the ancestral Puebloan people between 1190 and 1300 CE, represent perhaps the ultimate expression of defensive planning integrated with spiritual purpose and environmental harmony. These stone cities, tucked into alcoves high on canyon walls, were accessible only by precarious trails that could be easily defended by a few determined warriors. The location provided not only military advantages but also protection from the elements. The overhanging rock sheltered the buildings from rain and snow, while the southern exposure captured maximum sunlight during winter months. Storage chambers carved deep into the rock held enough food to sustain the inhabitants through long sieges, while hidden springs provided reliable water sources that enemies could not cut off. The construction of these cliff dwellings required engineering skills that bordered on the miraculous. Stone blocks were quarried from the canyon walls using nothing more sophisticated than stone hammers and wooden wedges, then shaped and fitted with a precision that has allowed the buildings to survive for more than 7 centuries. The builders understood the properties of different types of stone, using harder materials for load-bearing walls and softer stone for interior partitions. Mortar was made from local clays mixed with organic materials that helped it flex with temperature changes without cracking, yet even these practical considerations were woven through with spiritual significance. The buildings were oriented according to astronomical alignments, with windows and doors positioned to mark important celestial events. Kivas, circular underground chambers used for religious ceremonies, were integral to the defensive plan, providing secure gathering spaces where the community could maintain its spiritual practices even during times of danger. The message was clear: we will defend not just our bodies and our property, but our way of life, our connection to the sacred, our identity as a people. The defensive capabilities of these cliff dwellings extended beyond their physical advantages. The communities that built them developed sophisticated systems for water management, food storage, and resource distribution that made them nearly self-sufficient during times of siege. Terraced gardens carved into canyon floors maximized agricultural production while remaining hidden from casual observation. Granaries built into natural caves were scattered throughout the cliff faces, ensuring that food supplies could not be captured or destroyed by a single successful attack. The social organization required to maintain these cliff settlements was itself a form of defense. Every member of the community had specialized knowledge essential to survival. Some understood the subtle signs that predicted changes in water flow. Others knew the secret locations of emergency food caches. Still others maintained the oral traditions that preserved vital information about defensive tactics and enemy movements. This distributed knowledge system meant that the community could not be crippled by the loss of any single leader or group of specialists. The defensive systems of the Plains tribes present yet another variation on these themes, adapted to the vast grasslands where mobility was survival and concealment often meant the difference between life and death. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and other horse-mounted peoples developed what might be called liquid fortifications, defensive arrangements that could be assembled and dissolved as quickly as a thunderstorm crosses the prairie. The introduction of horses fundamentally transformed plains warfare, creating new possibilities for both attack and defense. War parties could now strike at targets hundreds of miles from their home territories, moving faster than news of their approach. But the same mobility that made these groups formidable attackers also made them vulnerable to pursuit and counterattack. Their defensive systems had to be as fluid as the wind-blown grass, capable of adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. A war party moving across the plains might seem to casual observation like a loose collection of individual riders, but closer examination would reveal sophisticated defensive formations. Scouts ranged far ahead and to the sides, maintaining visual contact through hand signals and mirror flashes. The main body moved in patterns that allowed for rapid deployment into fighting formation while keeping the horses fresh and the warriors alert to threats from any direction. Rear guards trailed behind, watching for pursuit and ready to delay any following enemy long enough for the main force to prepare for battle or escape. The horses themselves were trained for warfare, responding to knee pressure and voice commands that left their riders' hands free for weapons. Different breeds were selected for different purposes: swift ponies for scouting and pursuit, sturdy mounts for long-distance travel, powerful war horses for close combat. The care and training of these animals was a specialized art passed down through generations of horse cultures, creating bonds between warrior and mount that often proved decisive in life-or-death situations. When these nomadic peoples made temporary camps, their arrangements reflected the same integration of practical and spiritual considerations we have seen elsewhere. The camp circle was oriented according to sacred directions, with each family's position determined by clan membership and ceremonial obligations. Yet this spiritual order also served defensive purposes. Every adult knew exactly where to go and what to do if the camp came under attack, and the circular arrangement meant that defenders could concentrate force in any direction without confusion or delay. The teepees that sheltered these mobile communities were themselves defensive structures designed to be quickly erected or dismantled as circumstances required. Their conical shape shed wind and rain effectively, while their hide coverings could stop arrows and even some musket balls. The smoke flaps at the top could be adjusted not only for ventilation but for concealment, reducing the visibility of cooking fires that might give away the camp's location to distant observers. Perhaps most mysterious of all were the vision quests and dream practices that some tribes used as elements of their defensive strategy. Young warriors would fast and pray in isolated locations, seeking spiritual visions that might reveal the location of enemies, the best times for attack or retreat, or the outcome of impending conflicts. To modern minds, this might seem like superstition, but consider the practical effects. Individuals who spent days alone in the wilderness, in heightened states of awareness, would inevitably notice subtle signs and patterns that might escape more casual observation. These vision seekers often returned from their quests with detailed knowledge of animal movements, weather patterns, and seasonal changes that could have profound military significance. A warrior who had observed migration routes during a vision quest might know where enemies would be forced to travel at particular times of year. Someone who had spent days watching the sky might be able to predict storms that could provide cover for movement or make certain defensive positions untenable. The preparation for these vision quests was itself a form of military training, teaching young people to survive alone in the wilderness with minimal resources, to read the subtle signs of weather and season, to move silently through different types of terrain. The spiritual experiences that occurred during these retreats were inseparable from the practical skills being developed, creating warriors who approached defensive challenges with confidence, born of both earthly knowledge and spiritual insight. The line between spiritual insight and military intelligence blurred in ways that European minds found difficult to comprehend. Native defenders operated in a world where dreams could reveal enemy plans, where animal spirits might provide warnings of approaching danger, where the proper performance of ceremonies could influence the outcome of battles. Whether or not we believe in the literal truth of such practices, their psychological and social effects were undeniably real. They created communities of people who felt themselves to be under the protection of powerful spiritual forces and who approached defensive challenges with confidence born of that protection. The seasonal ceremonies that marked the passage of years in these communities often included elements specifically related to defense and warfare. Spring rituals might include prayers for protection during the coming season of conflict, while autumn ceremonies gave thanks for survival through another year of potential dangers. Winter gatherings provided opportunities for warriors to share experiences, plan future strategies, and train younger members of the community in the arts of war and defense. The weapons used in these defensive systems were as varied as the landscapes they protected. In the eastern woodlands, warriors carried bows made from yew or ash, their arrows tipped with points napped from chert or obsidian. War clubs were crafted from ironwood or hickory, their striking heads shaped to crush bone and armor alike. In the southwest, atlatls extended the range and power of thrown spears, while in the plains, the introduction of horses led to the development of specialized cavalry weapons, lances for mounted combat, short bows for shooting from horseback, and war clubs designed for close-quarters fighting. But perhaps more important than any individual weapon was the understanding of how different armaments worked together in coordinated defensive systems. Archers provided long-range harassment of approaching enemies, forcing them to advance under constant pressure. Spear carriers formed defensive lines that could stop cavalry charges or channel attacking forces into killing zones. Club and axe warriors served as the ultimate line of defense, engaging in hand-to-hand combat when all other measures failed. The shields carried by many native warriors were not merely protective devices, but complex symbols of spiritual power and tribal identity. Made from buffalo hide or wood, they were often decorated with images received in visions, animals that served as spiritual guardians, geometric patterns that represented cosmic forces, scenes from mythical battles between supernatural beings. The act of painting these shields was itself a ceremony, connecting the warrior to the spiritual sources of protection and power. As we let these mysteries settle into our consciousness like sediment drifting to the bottom of a still pond, we begin to understand that the native peoples of North America developed defensive systems that were more sophisticated than Europeans initially recognized, precisely because they operated according to different assumptions about the nature of warfare, community, and the relationship between the physical and spiritual worlds. Their fortifications were silent not because they were weak, but because they were woven so thoroughly into the landscape and the spiritual life of the people that they became nearly invisible to outsiders. An earthwork might appear to be merely a ceremonial site until the moment it revealed itself as a carefully planned stronghold. A village might seem defenseless until attackers discovered that every trail leading to it was watched, every approach anticipated, every movement detected by sentries who seemed to materialize from the forest itself like spirits given form. The sophistication of these defensive systems extended to their psychological and cultural dimensions. Communities that felt themselves to be protected by powerful spiritual forces fought with a confidence and determination that often proved decisive in battle. Warriors who had spent years learning to read the subtle signs of their environment could anticipate enemy movements and respond to changing conditions with an agility that confused and demoralized their opponents. These silent fortifications continue to guard their secrets, even as archaeologists carefully map their outlines and measure their dimensions. The great earthworks still rise from Ohio valleys, their purposes as enigmatic as ever. The signal fire peaks still command views across vast distances, though the smoke that once connected them has long since dispersed. The cliff dwellings still nestle in their rocky alcoves, empty now, but somehow still watchful, still protecting the mysteries of their builders. Modern visitors to these sites often report a sense of presence, a feeling that they are being observed by unseen watchers. Perhaps this is simply the effect of imagination working on landscapes that clearly show evidence of human planning and intention. Or perhaps something more subtle is at work, the accumulated weight of centuries of human attention and spiritual practice, creating spaces that continue to resonate with the purposes for which they were created. In the end, perhaps the greatest mystery is how completely these sophisticated defensive systems have been forgotten or misunderstood by the world that replaced them. The silent fortifications speak to us across the centuries in a language that we are only beginning to relearn, a language that recognizes no separation between protecting the body and nurturing the spirit, between military strategy and sacred ceremony, between the practical necessities of survival and the deeper mysteries of existence itself. The lessons these ancient defensive systems offer extend far beyond military history. They show us possibilities for human communities that integrate spiritual practice with practical necessity, that work with natural systems rather than against them, that create security through harmony rather than domination. In our own age of global conflict and environmental crisis, these silent fortifications may have more to teach us than we have yet begun to understand. As we drift from the realm of mystery into the quiet chambers where power dwelt, let us imagine ourselves slipping like shadows through the elevated world of those who commanded while others served, who spoke while others listened, who wore the weight of entire people's survival on their shoulders, like mantles woven from responsibility and privilege. While you, our anonymous warrior from the first part of our journey, woke each morning to the gnawing certainty of hunger and the endless repetition of survival tasks, others in your community stirred to a different rhythm. Their feet touched floors covered with the finest woven mats, their bodies wrapped in robes decorated with shells that had traveled hundreds of miles through ancient trade networks, their faces painted with pigments as valuable as gold to mark their elevated status within the intricate hierarchy of native society. Picture a Haudenosaunee clan, mother rising in her longhouse, her movements deliberate and unhurried, as befits someone whose decisions could send young men to war or preserve villages in peace. Around her, the longhouse awakens with the soft rustling of perhaps 50 relatives, children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews, all connected to her through the maternal bloodlines that formed the backbone of Iroquois society. But while her extended family begins the daily tasks of water carrying and fire tending that we have already witnessed, she moves toward responsibilities of an entirely different nature. Her breakfast, prepared by younger women who consider such service an honor, consists not of thin corn gruel, but of rich hominy enriched with maple syrup, perhaps accompanied by dried berries and nuts that have been carefully preserved from the autumn harvest. Meat, deer, bear, fish, caught in the rivers, appears on her eating mat with a regularity that would seem miraculous to families struggling through the lean months of late winter. She eats slowly, thoughtfully, her mind already turning toward the council session that will occupy much of her day. The clan mother's power is unlike the dramatic authority of European monarchs. She does not issue commands that must be instantly obeyed, does not control armies through fear, or distribute wealth through royal favor. Instead, her influence flows through the complex web of kinship and tradition that holds her society together like the interwoven fibers of a basket. When she speaks in council, her words carry the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who have held similar positions. When she remains silent, that silence speaks volumes about her assessment of the proposals under discussion. Her morning routine includes a ritual that would seem strange to European eyes, but which lies at the heart of Haudenosaunee governance. She consults with other clan mothers, sometimes through messengers, sometimes through visits, to ensure that the decisions she makes reflect not just her own judgment, but the collective wisdom of the women who truly control the political life of her people. These conversations are conducted in low voices, often while hands remain busy with seemingly domestic tasks, grinding corn, weaving baskets, preparing medicines. But the topics under discussion involve matters of life and death for entire communities. Across the continent, in the great houses of Cahokia, a different kind of elite power manifests itself through ceremony and display that would have impressed visitors from any civilization on Earth. The paramount chief who rules this Mississippi Valley metropolis begins his day surrounded by retainers whose very existence demonstrates his elevated status. Servants bring him water for washing, not the common water that others must carry from distant streams, but water that has been specially purified through elaborate rituals and carried in vessels decorated with intricate designs that speak of artistic skill and abundant leisure time. His body is painted each morning with pigments that tell the story of his lineage and achievements. Red ochre mixed with bear grease, white clay applied in patterns that reference astronomical observations, black charcoal creating designs that connect him to the spiritual world that legitimizes his earthly authority. The process takes hours and requires the services of specialists who have spent years learning the precise symbolism of each line and curve. While common people dress their bodies for warmth and protection from the elements, the chief's body becomes a living canvas that communicates his role as an intermediary between the human world and the realm of the spirits. His dwelling itself speaks of power exercised on a scale that dwarfs anything in the villages we have already visited. Built atop an artificial mound that required the labor of thousands of workers over many seasons, his house commands a view of the entire city and the river valley beyond. The walls are decorated with painted murals depicting scenes from the mythology that justifies his rule, spirits battling in cosmic wars, heroes undertaking quests that establish the proper order of society, astronomical events that mark the most sacred moments in his people's calendar. But perhaps the most striking difference between elite and common experience lies in the realm of food, not just in quantity, though the chief's tables groan under the weight of abundance that would seem fantastical to families subsisting on thin corn porridge, but in variety and preparation that transforms eating from mere survival into elaborate social ceremony. His morning meal might include venison roasted with wild herbs, fish caught in special weirs maintained exclusively for his use, corn prepared in a dozen different ways by cooks whose skill rivals that of any chef in human history. The social rituals surrounding these elite meals create theatre that reinforces power relationships throughout the community. Lesser chiefs and important visitors are seated according to complex protocols that everyone understands, but which require years of study to master completely. Food is served in a specific order that references both practical considerations, the most honored guests receive the choicest portions, and spiritual requirements that maintain proper relationships with the forces that govern abundance and scarcity. Yet, even as we observe these displays of wealth and authority, we must remember that native elite power operated according to principles that would seem foreign to European aristocracy. The Cahokia chief's authority, however impressive its outward manifestations, rested ultimately on his ability to maintain the spiritual and practical well-being of his people. His elaborate ceremonies were not merely self-aggrandizing displays, but essential performances that maintained the cosmic order upon which everyone's survival depended. If the rains failed to come, if the crops withered, if enemies threatened the city's security, the chief's authority would evaporate as quickly as morning mist. His power was conditional, earned rather than inherited, and subject to withdrawal if he failed to fulfill the obligations that came with his elevated status. The fine robes and elaborate meals and painted body were not simply personal luxuries, but tools of governance, visual demonstrations of his connection to sources of power that transcended individual ambition. In the Cherokee settlements of the Southeast, yet another variation of elite life developed, one that blended hereditary status with democratic decision-making in ways that created space for multiple forms of leadership to coexist within a single community. The peace chief, whose authority governed daily life during times of stability, lived quite differently from the war chief, who assumed command only when conflict threatened the village's security. The peace chief's day began with the same physical comforts we have observed elsewhere: fine food, decorated clothing, servants to attend to domestic needs. But his primary responsibilities involved the subtle work of maintaining social harmony within a community where individual autonomy was highly valued and coercive authority was viewed with deep suspicion. His morning might be spent listening to disputes between families, his afternoon in consultation with clan leaders about resource allocation, his evening in ceremonial activities that reinforced the spiritual foundations of Cherokee society. But when danger threatened, authority shifted seamlessly to the war chief, whose preparation for leadership had followed entirely different paths. While the peace chief developed skills in negotiation and consensus building, the war chief had spent his youth learning the arts of combat, strategy, and the inspiration of young men who would follow him into battle. His elite status was earned through demonstrated courage rather than inherited position, maintained through successful leadership rather than ceremonial display. The war chief's house might be less elaborately decorated than the peace chief's, his daily routine less cushioned by luxury and ceremony, but when crisis came, his word carried the immediate authority of life and death. Warriors, who might debate endlessly with the peace chief over village policies, would obey the war chief's battle commands without question, understanding that survival depended on unity of action rather than democratic consultation. In the pueblos of the Southwest, spiritual leadership created yet another form of elite existence, one that combined earthly authority with responsibilities that extended far beyond the merely human realm. The medicine men and ceremonial leaders who guided these communities through the complex annual cycle of religious observances lived lives that were simultaneously privileged and constrained, elevated above common concerns yet bound by obligations that touched every aspect of their existence. A Hopi medicine man might begin his day before dawn, not with the luxury of sleeping until his body had rested fully, but with pre-dawn prayers and rituals that maintained proper relationships with the spirits who controlled rain, fertility, and protection from enemies. His breakfast, while more abundant than that available to common families, was prepared according to dietary restrictions that connected every meal to spiritual requirements. Certain foods were forbidden during particular ceremonial seasons. Others required elaborate preparation rituals that transformed cooking from mundane task into sacred performance. His clothing, like that of other elites we have observed, communicated status through elaborate decoration and fine materials, but every design element carried spiritual significance that constrained his choices as much as it elevated his appearance. The feathers in his headdress had been obtained through specific rituals. The painted designs on his body referenced cosmic forces that he was responsible for keeping in proper balance. The jewelry he wore connected him to trade networks that stretched across the continent, but also to spiritual obligations that governed how such wealth could be accumulated and displayed. The spiritual leader's day was structured around ceremonial requirements that operated according to calendars more complex than anything developed in contemporary Europe. His responsibilities included not only the proper performance of established rituals, but also the interpretation of omens, the modification of ceremonies to address changing circumstances, and the training of younger men who would eventually assume similar responsibilities. Yet perhaps the most striking aspect of spiritual elite status was its radical democracy. Anyone could potentially receive the visions or demonstrate the spiritual gifts that qualified for religious leadership, regardless of family background or material wealth. A poor man's son who showed unusual sensitivity to spiritual forces might find himself elevated to positions of influence that exceeded those held by the children of chiefs, while the offspring of established leaders might discover that spiritual authority could not be inherited but must be earned through personal revelation and community recognition. As we observe these various forms of elite existence, the clan mother's quiet influence, the paramount chief's elaborate ceremony, the peace and war chief's complementary authority, the medicine man's spiritual responsibilities, we begin to understand that native societies developed complex systems for concentrating power and resources while maintaining checks and balances that prevented the kind of absolute authority that characterized European monarchies. The luxuries enjoyed by native elites were real and substantial: fine food, beautiful clothing, comfortable living conditions, freedom from the grinding daily labor that occupied most people's lives. But these privileges came with obligations that made elite existence as much burden as benefit. The clan mother, who could influence decisions affecting thousands of people, was also responsible for the consequences of those decisions. The paramount chief, who lived in splendor atop his artificial mountain, was also expected to maintain the spiritual and practical well-being of an entire city. The medicine man, whose word could determine the timing of crucial ceremonies, also bore responsibility for any disasters that might result from mistaken interpretation of spiritual signs. In the end, what distinguished native elite existence from the common experience we explored at the beginning of our journey was not simply access to luxury and freedom from physical labor, but participation in forms of responsibility that extended far beyond personal survival. While the common warrior's concerns centered on protecting his immediate family and contributing to his village's defense, the elite shouldered obligations that encompassed entire peoples, future generations, and relationships with spiritual forces that governed the fundamental structures of existence. Their fine robes and elaborate meals and comfortable dwellings were not merely personal indulgences, but tools of governance, symbols of authority that made it possible for them to fulfill responsibilities that required them to speak for thousands of people, negotiate with enemies and allies, and maintain connections to sources of power that transcended individual human understanding. As the stars emerge overhead, the same stars that once looked down on council fires, where these elite leaders gathered to make decisions that would shape their people's destinies, we can almost hear the echo of their voices, measured, thoughtful, weighted with the knowledge that their words could bring peace or war, abundance or famine, survival or destruction, to communities that depended on their wisdom and judgment. Their world has passed into memory, but the responsibilities they carried, the careful balance they maintained between personal privilege and public obligation, the ways they wove together practical governance and spiritual authority, continue to offer lessons about leadership and power that speak across the centuries to anyone willing to listen for the whispered wisdom of those who once bore the weight of their people's survival on shoulders draped with the finest materials their world could provide. And so we come to the end of our gentle journey through the forgotten corridors of time, having walked in the moccasins of the common warrior, witnessed the tragic grandeur of Tecumseh's dream, puzzled over the silent mysteries of ancient earthworks, and observed the delicate balance of power and responsibility that elevated some while binding them to the service of all. As you settle deeper into whatever comfort surrounds you in this present moment, perhaps soft sheets that those long-ago peoples could never have imagined, perhaps walls that shut out the cold more completely than any buffalo hide, perhaps the simple luxury of knowing that water flows from taps and food waits in cabinets rather than in distant streams and uncertain hunts. Let your mind drift back once more over the landscape we have traveled together. Think of that anonymous warrior whose daily struggles opened our story, rising each morning to hunger and cold, to the endless repetition of tasks that meant survival for his family. His calloused hands that split firewood and carried water, his eyes that never stopped scanning the horizon for signs of danger, his shoulders that bore responsibilities he never chose but accepted with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that survival is not a single heroic act, but 10,000 small acts of persistence and care. Where he once sharpened arrows by firelight, suburban lawns now spread their manicured perfection. Where he once tracked deer through morning mist, highways carry their rivers of traffic. Where he once listened to the wind for messages that might mean life or death. The constant hum of air conditioning creates a barrier between us and the natural world that shaped every moment of his existence. Yet something of his watchfulness remains in the way a parent listens for a child's breathing in the night. Something of his patience endures in the way we tend to tasks that seem meaningless until the moment they prove essential. Something of his quiet courage echoes in every person who faces each day's challenges without knowing what the next dawn might bring. From his campfire, our minds traveled to follow Tecumseh through council circles where he painted visions of unity with words as carefully chosen as any diplomat's treaty language. We watched him grow from a grieving boy who lost his father to colonial violence into a man who carried the hopes of an entire continent on his shoulders, who spent his adult life traveling impossible distances to weave together peoples who had been enemies since time immemorial. His dream failed, as perhaps it was always destined to fail, crushed between forces too large for any single leader to redirect. But in the failure was a kind of victory, proof that even in the darkest hours, when everything familiar seems to be dissolving, it is possible to imagine a different future and to dedicate one's life to making that vision real. In council fires that burned across a dozen territories, in the patient work of building trust between ancient enemies, in the simple act of refusing to accept that defeat was inevitable, Tecumseh showed that hope itself can be a form of resistance. His voice has been silent for more than 2 centuries, but it still whispers in every attempt to bring divided people together, in every effort to imagine solutions to problems that seem too large for human intervention, in every person who chooses to plant trees whose shade will shelter generations they will never meet. From the world of politics and war, we drifted into mysteries that still puzzle archaeologists and dreamers, the great earthworks that snake across Ohio valleys like frozen rivers, the signal fire networks that carried messages faster than any modern communication could traverse the same distances on foot, the cliff dwellings that seem to grow from living rock in patterns that blend military necessity with spiritual significance so completely that the two become indistinguishable. These silent fortifications speak in a language we are still learning to understand, a language that recognizes no separation between protecting the body and nurturing the spirit, between practical defense and cosmic harmony. They remind us that the peoples who built them saw the world as a unified whole rather than a collection of separate parts, understood that true security comes not from building higher walls, but from maintaining proper relationships with all the forces, seen and unseen, human and more than human, that shape the conditions of existence. In our time, when we build barriers between nations and carry weapons that could destroy entire civilizations, when we treat the earth as a collection of resources rather than a living whole, these ancient defensive philosophies offer whispered wisdom about other ways of being in the world, other approaches to the eternal human challenge of staying safe while remaining connected to the larger web of life. Finally, we climbed the artificial mountains where elites lived their lives of privilege and burden, wearing fine robes that marked their status while binding them to obligations that extended far beyond personal comfort. We observed the clan mothers whose quiet words could prevent wars or launch them, the paramount chiefs whose elaborate ceremonies maintained cosmic order, the peace and war leaders whose complementary authorities created space for both negotiation and resistance, the spiritual guides whose visions shaped the daily lives of entire communities. Their world knew luxury, foods prepared by skilled cooks, clothing decorated with materials gathered from across the continent, dwellings that commanded views of vast territories. But it also knew that privilege without responsibility is empty indulgence, that authority without accountability becomes tyranny, that power divorced from service to the common good corrupts both the powerful and the communities they claim to lead. In our time, when wealth concentrates in fewer and fewer hands, when leadership often seems disconnected from the lives of ordinary people, when power serves itself rather than the communities from which it emerges, these ancient patterns of elite obligation offer gentle reminders about other ways of organizing societies, other relationships between those who have much and those who have little. As we let these images and stories settle into the quiet corners of consciousness, we begin to see how they connect. The common warrior's daily vigilance supporting the diplomat's grand strategies, the mysterious earthworks providing the spiritual foundation for the elite's temporal authority, all of it woven together in patterns that recognized the fundamental interdependence of all life. These were not perfect societies. They knew conflict and inequality, suffering and failure, all the challenges that seem to follow human communities wherever they form. But they were societies that understood something we seem to have forgotten, that individual survival and community well-being are not separate goals, but different aspects of the same fundamental challenge, that short-term security and long-term sustainability must be balanced rather than traded against each other, that the practical and spiritual dimensions of existence cannot be separated without impoverishing both. Tonight, as you drift toward the rest that these long-ago peoples earned through their daily labors, as you settle into comfort that they could never have imagined, let their stories remind you that the deepest forms of wealth are not measured in material possessions, but in the richness of relationships, to family and community, to the natural world that sustains all life, to the traditions and wisdom that connect each generation to those who came before and those who will follow. The buffalo no longer darken the plains in numbers beyond counting. The forests that once stretched unbroken from ocean to ocean have been reduced to scattered fragments. The rivers that once ran clear and cold now carry the burden of industrial civilization's accumulated debris. But something essential persists: the human capacity for adaptation, for finding meaning in difficulty, for creating beauty in the midst of struggle, for maintaining hope when reason suggests despair. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between darkness and light, when the ancient rhythms of earth and sky continue their eternal dance, regardless of human ambition or anxiety, the wisdom of these earlier peoples whispers across the centuries like wind through grass, reminding us that we too are part of something larger than our individual concerns, connected to all who came before and responsible to all who will follow. Let that whisper carry you now toward the rest you have earned, toward dreams that may bring their own forms of wisdom, toward the peace that comes from understanding that your life, however ordinary it may seem, is part of the great continuing story of human survival, human dignity, human hope. In the morning you will wake to your own challenges, your own responsibilities, your own opportunities to demonstrate the quiet courage that has carried our species through every crisis it has faced. But tonight, rest easy in the knowledge that you are part of a story larger than any individual life, connected to ancestors whose names may be forgotten but whose struggles made your existence possible. Heir to wisdom that has been tested by time and found worthy of preservation in the memories and dreams of all who choose to listen for the gentle voices that speak to us across the vast spaces of history, reminding us that we are never alone, never without resources, never beyond the reach of the love that connects all living things in the great web of existence that encompasses past and present and future in its endless, nurturing embrace. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of this continuing story, this gentle river of human experience that flows from the deepest past toward futures we can barely imagine, carrying with it all the wisdom and courage and hope that each generation has contributed to the great work of learning how to be human in a world that challenges and sustains us in equal measure. The stars that shine above you tonight are the same stars that look down on council fires and signal peaks, on earth lodges and cliff dwellings, on all the forgotten places where people like you faced each day's challenges with whatever strength and wisdom they could gather. Their light connects you to that vast community of human experience, and in that connection you can find the rest and peace that come from understanding that you are part of something eternal, something worthy, something that will continue long after your own small part of the story has been completed and added to the great treasury of human memory and hope. Rest now. Dream well. Wake tomorrow ready to add your own thread to the endless weaving of the human story, your own voice to the quiet chorus that sings across time of survival and dignity, of struggle and triumph, of the inexhaustible capacity of the human spirit to find light in darkness and meaning in mystery. Thank you for wandering through another quiet corner of history with me tonight. If this slow story brought you a little peace, feel free to subscribe. I share fresh, gentle stories almost each day. There's another calm tale waiting on the screen, or you can simply tap below to join our circle of nighttime historians. Sleep well until the next story.